Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jenna Flanagan, and I'm host of WNET Group's award-winning multi-platform news magazine, Metro Focus. The WNET Group is home to Channel 13, America's flagship PBS station located in New York City, and 13 airs Metro Focus 7 nights a week. Now, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for joining us for Close to Home, Town Halls on Housing Equality. Each week, we are gathering with frontline thinkers and doers to examine an array of complex topics like housing and economic justice, food sovereignty and security, homelessness and community, cultural displacement, and media narratives about housing. The summit will present frank talk about issues and solutions with an understanding of history and eyes towards the future. Close to Home is taping live every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern from April 26th to May 24th. Learn more at 13.org/close to home. Tonight's program, Circle Made of Soil, a town hall about food sovereignty and security, is presented by the WNET Group and Chasing the Dream, our national multi platform reporting initiative that explores inequality, opportunity, and justice in America. You can watch programs produced by Chasing the Dream at pbs.org/chasing the dream or at youtube.com/on the brink PBS. Please subscribe. Part of our station's mission is to provide meaningful experiences to our audiences and communities to educate, entertain, and inspire. By bringing together leaders who are at the front lines of creating equality, we hope Close to Home will provide new perspectives and ideas for strengthening and enlivening all our communities. We will have time for an audience Q&A towards the end, so as you watch the live stream, please post your questions in the comments section, and please join us again next Wednesday for part 3 of this series, More Than Shelter, a town hall about homelessness and community. I'd like to thank our promotional partners for tonight's episode of Close to Home. We're grateful for the support of Community to Community, the Food as Medicine Collaborative, the Native Food Sovereignty Alliance, and Toto Verde. Thank you also to our ASL interpreters for tonight, Rashida Sharif and Aisha Simpson. Last, a very special thank you to WNET's 400 plus community partners. Now, their input has shaped our thinking around this topic and many others. A quick reminder that the views expressed by tonight's guests and attendees are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the WNET group. And now, I'm pleased to introduce WNET's Director of Community Partnerships and the curator of Close to Home, Brian Tate.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Wonderful to see you always. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to begin by paying respect to the Lenape people, upon whose unceded and ancestral homeland lies the city we call Manhattan. Please join me in making this affirmation from a place of deep humility and solidarity with an ongoing commitment to decolonization and racial justice. I want to also acknowledge the continuity between our being here today and the struggle for liberation and the full expression of our humanity, which has transcended generations. Many lives have been lost in that struggle against forces of racism, fascism, xenophobia, and hate. We hold all those people close and we honor them when we gather across communities to speak truth and create change. Now, really thrilled to have you here for the second week of Close to Home. We had a phenomenal kickoff last week with our town hall, The Cost of Living, which was a discussion about housing and economic justice. And we truly hope you will join us next Wednesday for a phenomenal talk about homelessness and community called More Than Shelter. Tonight's town hall is on a topic which came up very often in our discussion with community partners about issues that are impacting people in New York City and beyond. And that is around issues of food security and sovereignty. So we're thrilled to have this discussion tonight, Circle Made of Soil. We'll looking forward to that conversation that'll come very soon. Every time we hold these town halls, we start with a brief performance by a gifted musician or spoken word artist to gather us across this virtual space and remind us why we have come together to discuss these tough topics, and it's for the culture. We're thrilled to have with us tonight someone very, very special to open tonight's event. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mexican-American singer-songwriter Renee Ghost.
How are you, Brian? It's so nice to be here tonight.
Wonderful to have you here, Renee. I'll tell you, it's been a delight not only to meet you and hear your music, but I'm also such a fan. So we're just thrilled. Where? I'm sorry, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say I'm excited to perform this song for you. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. Been living in New York for the past 15 years, but originally, I'm from the U.S.-Mexico border down in Arizona, from Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora border. So yeah,
Great.
My music has a lot of that influence culturally.
Well, Renee, it meant a lot that when I reached out to you about tonight, that your response was immediately yes, and we're just honored to have you here. Can you tell us what the song is that you'll be performing tonight?
So this song is called Pozole. Pozole is a dish that is made throughout Mexico, and it has different regional variants. And I found it to be appropriate for tonight's topic. A lot of people don't know this, but I was a professional cook for 11 years, and my whole family is in the food industry and the food business. And so food is very dear to my heart, and I know that it transmits culture. And this song talks about a dish that my grandmother used to teach me how to cook, which is called pozole.
I'd like to tell you that I knew that part of your background when I reached out, but I did not. Very happy for the serendipity. Looking forward to the song, everyone. We give you Renee Ghost.
Gigante de amor enorme, mujer maravilla, siempre fuerte pero noble, mano firme de amasar las tortillas, tú nunca llorabas, guerrera, ni cuando picabas cebolla. Mejor endulzabas tus penas cantando frente a la olla y me decías, revuélvele bien y que no le falte sal. Tú ríete de la vida, pa' que no se ría de ti nunca jamás. Tu amor sazonaba memorias, orégano, ajo y guajillo, sofrito de mil historias, y el toque secreto siempre fue nuestro apellido. Los rábanos sobre la mesa, cilantro, limón y lechuga. Muelo un un chiltepín con la servilleta y aún te escucho cantar desde la tumba. Revuélvele bien y que no le falte sal. Tú ríete de la vida pa' que no se ría de ti nunca jamás. Mija, revuélvele bien y que no le falte sal. Tú ríete de la vida pa' que no se ría de ti nunca jamás, abuela de mis amores.
Thank you so much, Renee. Oh my gosh. So special.
Thank you so much.
So special.
That one's for all the grandmothers, you know, and everybody who's giving us the love throughout the food, everybody present here tonight with a lot of love. Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
A real delight. Everyone, if you were as knocked out by Renee's performance as we were, please learn more at her website, reneegoust.com, ReneeGoust, reneegoust.com, and that should also be dropped into the chat where you are. Renee, looking forward to seeing you live sometime very soon.
June 3rd in the Bronx. Look it up online. It's going to be great.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Whoa, that was special. Everyone, we're going to move right along. Please join me now in welcoming tonight's incredible panel for Circle Made of Soil, a town hall about food sovereignty and security. You can read everyone's full bios at 13.org/close to home, and a direct link should also be in your chat for their bios. Remember that the panel will be taking your questions as well, so please post them in that same chat. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight, Jocelyn Ramirez, founder, Todo Verde, and co-founder across our kitchen tables. Jocelyn, such a delight to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. I'm really moved by Renee's song. It was so beautiful. I made sure to follow her on social media. So for everybody watching, make sure to follow her and all the panelists that we have here tonight.
Excellent. Excellent. And let me introduce those panelists. Naima Dore, founder and program director, Somali American Farmers Association, and the owner of Naima's Farm, LLC. Naima, wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
You bet. Rosalinda Guillen, founder, Community to Community. Rosalinda?
Thank you. It's exciting to be here with you all.
Excellent. Lillian Hill of the Hopi Nation and the Quitsan Nation, Executive Director, Native Food Sovereignty Alliance. Lillian?
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Rita Nguyen, MD, founder, Food as Medicine Collaborative. Rita?
Hi, good evening.
Great to see you. And last and not least, Malik Kenyatta Yakini, Executive Director, Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. Malik?
Thank you so much, Brian. Honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. Jocelyn, I'm going to hand it over to you. I want to remind everyone, Jocelyn's got a bunch of great questions for tonight's panel, and they would also love to hear your questions. So please drop them in the chat where you are, and she'll get to those too. I'm going to sign off. I'll see you guys in a little bit.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to each of you for being a part of this conversation. I've been researching your work over the last few days, getting to know more about you. I feel like I know each of you a little bit more. So I'm so excited to have you be a part of this conversation. I'm going to start off with a brief statement before we jump right in. So just wanted to start off with talking about Feeding America, which is a national network of hunger relief organizations, reports that 34 million people are food insecure in the United States and that 53 million people turned to food programs in 2021. So, to help frame this issue, Feeding America advises food insecurity is an economic condition. Millions of people in America are just one job less, missed paycheck, or medical emergency away from hunger. But hunger doesn't affect everyone equally. Some groups, like children, seniors, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, face hunger at much higher rates. In fact, Feeding America and other experts in this field identify systemic racism as a driver to food insecurity. The 2019 American Community Survey, conducted by the Census Bureau, backs up that assessment, reporting that most people of color experience hunger at roughly 2 times or twice the rate of whites, and sometimes more. So, given that picture, let's explore the leadership work being done within communities of color to advance food sovereignty, food security, and food as medicine that empower people who live at the front lines of hunger. So, obviously, this really encompasses the work that each of you is trying to do, right? This is a driving force for a lot of us here. And so, I wanted to frame the conversation in kind of 3 different levels or tiers, for lack of a better term, really thinking about, first off, the community challenges in achieving food sovereignty, and secondly, how each of you are overcoming those challenges within your respective organizations, and lastly, what's next and how others can support your community's work. Then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So again, audience members watching, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end of the conversation. So we'll start here with just talking through some of the challenges. And this question is specifically framed for Rosalinda and Malik. So we've read recent news reports on the weakening of child labor laws and the expansion of the H-2B visa program, which brings guest workers into the workforce who often face really terrible conditions. Can you speak to the exploitation of workers across the food systems? What are you seeing on the ground? What makes this important, and how can we counter it? And Rosalinda, we will start with you.
Thank you for that question. Actually, when you're talking about food sovereignty and food security, I think it's important for all eaters to understand where their food is coming from. And I think, as a farm worker, this is something that we have been addressing in my organization and myself personally all my life. I'm, several generations of farm workers in the United States and Mexico. So I actually started working in the fields when I was 10 years old. And that was way back in the early 1960s. And I think now, as we do our organizing on the ground in the farm worker communities, child labor is back. But it's not just in the fields where we're growing food on the ground. It's in all up and down the food chain, it appears to be, even getting worse. And we're finding this child labor being linked to immigration, the lack of immigration, and the vulnerability that families are getting kind of locked into. So then, in order to survive in the United States, a lot of the children actually get sent to work, and their families are so desperate for the income that this is happening. I think you've heard or read the news and recent news reports of children in meatpacking plants where they're, cleaning the killing floor in very traumatic type of work. I think that this is something that we really need to think about when we're addressing food security and what food sovereignty really means to all of us. It is a very real issue growing in the United States right now because of the low wages and the need of low income families, but also it's all tied up with immigration and immigration reform. I don't know if Malik has something to add to that in Detroit. I know that we're seeing it in many areas of the West, and especially in rural areas and in on the west side of the nation. I'm actually based in Northwest Washington, in Washington State.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosalinda. First of all, I think it's important to distinguish the difference between food security and food sovereignty. Food security at its base really means that people have adequate calories to go about their daily business and to survive. But as my friend Raj Patel says, you can have food security in prison. So clearly, what we're striving for is something more than just people having enough calories in their diets. So food sovereignty is that something more that we're striving for. And there's many definitions of food sovereignty, but I think the Nation of Livia Campesina defines it well, and I would invite people to go to Livia Campesina's website to get the full definition. But a layperson's definition is that food sovereignty is really placing the responsibility for defining and shaping the food system in the hands of those who are producing and consuming the food, as opposed to that being defined by market forces, which is the case in American society. The vast majority of the food that we consume is sold to us by multinational corporations. One of the issues that we have in the American food system is that although most people would intuitively say that food is very expensive, the reality is that many of the cost of producing food, much of the cost of producing food has been externalized. And one of the ways they externalized is by the exploitation of workers. And so, as Rosalinda mentioned, we see both the exploitation and abuse of people who are farm workers. We see the exploitation and abuse of people who are working in meat processing plants. And we certainly see the exploitation of the many, many workers who work in the restaurant industry. In fact, in the city of Detroit, the restaurant industry and other food related fields is the second largest employer. And so we see a tremendous number of people who are working in food processing and the restaurant industry who are being paid deplorable wages, who often have to work in conditions that are unsafe and not respectful. So the bigger question, though, I think also has to do with global capitalism and why what we call migrant workers come to the United States in the first place. Why are they leaving their countries? Why can't they achieve a high level of life in the countries that they live in? And those answers go right back to American imperialism and the history of European colonialism and the many ways in which those systems have disempowered Black and Brown people in this country and throughout the world.
For breaking that down. I really appreciate the taking a deeper dive into the definitions of each one of those terms that we use sometimes almost interchangeably. So I really, really appreciate that, Malik. I want to move on to a question here for Naima and Lillian. Both of you work with your communities that specifically look at farming the land, but also in bringing communities together. And so in light of your commitment to inspire young people of color to embrace farming and traditional cultural foodways, how do you navigate the lack of access to land and resources needed to educate your community on trusted ancestral farming techniques? We can start with Lillian.
Wonderful. Thank you for that question. That question, contains a lot of complexity. And so for me as an Indigenous person and a person who, is grounded to my traditional foodways and also within the sector that I work in, within the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, I see, connections that exist, have existed and continue to exist in pre-colonial times as well. And so if we're looking at your question and framing it in terms of a pre-colonial paradigm or a paradigm that highlights liberation and freedom, as Indigenous peoples, we have, we have been caretakers of this land for many, many generations. And so the land itself and our communities, our tribal nations and communities are connected through origin stories and through through cultural songs and traditions and dances. So our nations have a very deep connection to the land, which we call Turtle Island. And so because of those, through those connections, we've been able to build kinship relations with other tribal nations throughout our territories as well. And so those ancestral trade routes that that my ancestors and our Indigenous ancestors have developed, enabled and necessitated us as Indigenous people to be in relation to the land itself. And so in that way, access to land is extremely important. And we view, the land in terms of a foodscape, or in terms of beyond just the commercialization, or beyond commercial agriculture in general. And so as Indigenous people, we have, fishing rights, hunting rights, we have rights, as three-party citizens. We're citizens to our own nations, we're citizens of the United States government, and we're also citizens of states as well. So as Indigenous peoples, we have very complex relationships to land, and through colonization and assimilation, and through imperialism and the domination of our nations, many of our tribal nations have been displaced from our traditional territories. And the displacement of our nations has resulted in a lack of access to our traditional hunting, fishing areas, to our traditional stewarding areas, which comprise of seasonal foraging areas. And so I think in terms of our nations really looking towards a liberatory framework that centers freedom and centers our approach as Indigenous peoples in relation to the land. I believe that there are, just many solutions to that. But in terms of the land back movement that is emerging, and which many of our nations are a part of, we are, reimagining ourselves as Indigenous peoples in relation to the land, in relation to the paradigm that we face and have faced for many, many generations, in terms of being displaced, in terms of being colonized, and in terms of, existing within the capitalist paradigm and framework, and really working towards remembering our relations and remembering our kinship relations to the land and to our foodscapes, and being able, to really sit and center ourselves in terms of reforging those traditional trade routes and traditional relations between our nations, to rebuild our food systems and our foodways, and also to reforge our kinship relations to not only the land, but also to our bird relations, our animal relations, and to the waterways that sustain us, and to, the mountains and the valleys and the hills and the springs and the sacred places that our people have existed from and continue to caretake and steward as well. So in the presence of some very hard borders and some very strict federal and state regulations and land theft, our people continue to caretake and steward, I would say, public lands, and continue to fight for rights to have access to our traditional territories, to gather our seasonal foods, to hunt, to steward and caretake, I would say, on a larger landscape basis across imposed borders and imposed boundaries that exist right now through state and federal regulation. And so there's many factors to consider, I think, in your initial question, but from my thinking, I think that's what's most important, is to center and to really highlight the fact that Indigenous people continue to exist in a really interesting spatial imaginary, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lillian. It is a little bit of a loaded question, right? So yeah, I totally understand that it's like a processing in getting to a point where you're able to kind of continue to cultivate all your ancestral or traditional ways. Naima, can you share a little bit about how you're doing this in your work in Minnesota?
Thank you. It is a loaded question, and I
Yeah.
think Lillian did a fantastic job, pretty much highlighting what I wanted to contribute in this discussion. And actually, in fact, it's the reason why I got into farming. I initially started growing microgreens inside my tiny apartment, which led me to explore a lot of things. Growing up back home in Somalia, we had access to fresh food all the time. We did things communal way, and so I really missed that component. As many immigrant families that trying to navigate and try to understand how to access fresh food, access culturally, food that they're familiar with. That was a piece that I was missing, and I feel like my community now, we're working together and reclaiming our food and our culture, but more importantly, really working with the youth so that we can preserve our culture. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is really taking all of the tools and the knowledge that I was able to gain, just learning from the community here, whether it's my indigenous brothers and sisters or other communities that been farming for a long time here, but also just really putting my attention and my energy towards working with my elders because they have so much to share, and I really want to make sure that those stories don't get lost, especially now that we're trying to figure out what we can grow together, especially living in Minnesota, which, we have a very short window growing season. And so I'm really, committed to working and exploring that with my community real time. I mean, we've been here for almost 40 years, and I feel like we adapted this lifestyle of Western way of consuming food that basically they're not good for us, and so slowly, I'm trying to create a space where we can grow a lot of the things that we're familiar with, such as, I mentioned earlier about millet and exploring sorghum and few other crops that are native to my country.
Yeah. Thank you so much for both of you sharing. I actually ate millet for breakfast today. So really thinking about eating things that are grown locally that are a little bit better for a drought tolerant growing landscape here. So Rita, I want to turn it to you. And we know that food insecurity and unhealthy foods have tremendous health impacts. And would you mind telling us a little bit more about what food as medicine means to you specifically and how it intersects with the issues that we've been discussing so far?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question and thanks for having me today. I'm just, I feel really honored and humbled by the other leaders on this panel. To me, I'm glad you asked me about food as medicine because I often find that when people use that term, sometimes they mean something that is much more prescriptive and disempowering than I think it could be. So some folks use food as medicine to say, oh, if you prescribe certain foods and tell people what to eat and they have certain packaged meals, that's going to improve their health. And yeah, maybe you might improve their health, but that doesn't really empower patients to take an active role in their health. They're these, passive recipients of healthcare and food. And so for the Food as Medicine Collaborative, which I helped to found, when we talk about food as medicine, it's really about how do we leverage healthcare to really address food insecurity as a health issue, not just an issue that the nonprofit community has to handle. Food insecurity is a health issue. As a clinician and as a physician, I was just incredibly frustrated by the fact that so many of my patients had diseases like diabetes and hypertension, and all I could do was just pile on prescriptions. There was nothing else I can do. And so this sort of calling of food as medicine is, from our perspective, is to say healthcare as a system, as one of these like systems of power that help to enforce some of the inequities that we see in our society. We can actually do better. We can do better as a healthcare delivery system and actually deliver healthcare rather than disease care by connecting these resources around food to our patients and to our community. And so for us, it's the concept of how do we message food as a way, as a means of folks getting access to health rather than just receiving pills. And then specifically to how our work relates to food sovereignty, the way that we've run our programming in San Francisco is to be very intentional about how we source the food, the type of staff that we hire. And so the Food is Medicine Club, we run a number of programs, about a dozen food pharmacies across 10 different clinics throughout the San Francisco County. And we're very intentional about the food that we provide to our patients are sourced from BIPOC owned or BIPOC led nonprofits and businesses that are trying to source food locally. We also have looked at supporting women owned, Latino owned restaurants in terms of providing access to meals to our patients as well. So I think trying to embody the values of food justice and food sovereignty as we try to reform a system like healthcare to be more oriented toward justice is sort of what we've been working on.
Yeah. It sounds like you're doing really amazing work. And I'd love to see how that continues to evolve and how all of your work can continue to intersect. It'll take time, but I feel like conversations like this synergetically are kind of how those things will become actual forming stepping stones to real movement together. So I have another question, last question in this part of the conversation, which is specifically for Rosalinda and Rita. We've been discussing the role of racism in driving hunger across our communities. Would you discuss the intersection with sexism? As visionary women of color leaders, how do you empower other women within your movement and field and navigate machismo or patriarchy? How do those forces affect the larger goal of food sovereignty? Rosalinda, we can start with you.
Well, I mean, I think it's essential, especially when you're talking about immigrant workers and this corporate food system that is looking to us as labor, specifically only as labor. And when you have women entering the fields, or I should say, you know, these big corporate farms, and you're working, it's really about us being production machines. And in that sense, women having to keep up with men and to almost have to compete, because in the industrial agricultural industry, you know, people are paid by piece rate, which means they have production quotas they have to meet. And I think that creates a very violent environment for women, and how they have to deal with making a decent wage for their families and their children causes a lot of that tension, that sexism, and both at work and off after they get off work, because they not only have to work in the fields to make their paycheck, but then after they get home, they need to take care of their family and their children. And it really creates overall an imbalance of women being able to participate. In our organization, Community to Community is a women-led organization, which means we make all the decision as women. And when we bring farm worker women in, we have a promotora program that is all women, mostly single mothers with children, heads of household that have to work in the fields, in agriculture, but at the same time, they're leading, some of them pretty large families, 6 to 8 children, sometimes male children. And the way that our culture in general, I have to say it's bad in our community, but it's growing in our country as overall. You know, women's rights and the ability for women to participate equitably seems to be in danger these days, and it affects us also. So we make a very intentional effort to have women lead, to have women make decisions, to have women participate in the planning and in the projects that we develop together, and then to go out into the community and reach out to farm workers, not just women, but men also, and children, and educate on what our rights are. But more than what our rights are, when we talk about food sovereignty, we're also talking about eating culturally appropriate food to the different cultures of people in this country. In our case, you know, it's our traditional foods and being able to access those foods in a way that's safe. I think that women have a sense of pretty strong leadership I shouldn't say pretty strong leadership, very strong leadership and perseverance in being able to maintain the culture of food and relationships and health. I really enjoyed starting the show with Renee singing that song about pozole, because it really reminds me in the farm worker community how we do use food for keeping ourselves healthy. There's teas, there's the cooking, but also the relationship, the emotional relationship of how we prepare the food and how we explain that to our families and to our children. I think that in our community, dealing with sexism and machismo and this competitiveness to make a wage because we're also poor is something that in our organization we're trying to address in a way that places mothers at the leadership of developing projects that are culturally appropriate to them related to food. And especially a lot of our farm worker women that are helping to lead our projects have male children, and it's developing that modeling of how we relate to each other and how women can take leadership and build equity within the movement and in the workplace. So it's central to our organization. We are a women-led organization, a farm worker women-led organization. I don't know how else to put it other than if you're going to talk about food sovereignty, it has to have that gender equity without the sense of I guess I'm trying to say keeping the capitalism component out of it. So it's not about competing for how much money you're making, but it's about the production of food on the land and the relationship between friends, family, and children and the food that you're growing, and then moving it to the food that you're cooking and how you're cooking it, and then how you share it together in community.
Yeah, absolutely. Rita, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I really just want to uplift everything that Rosalinda said. I work in public health and I work in healthcare. I'm lucky in some regards that public health tends to be dominated by women. So most of who I work with is women. But at the same time, as we often see in many industries, even though we may be dominated by women, the people in power tend to be men, and they tend to be white men. And so it is something that I have to navigate. And I also recognize my intersectionality of being a small Asian woman, and that certain people expect to hear from me a certain way. And so those are things that I do have to navigate in large bureaucracies and systems like healthcare or in government. And a mentor of mine once gave me this framework of IQ, EQ, and OQ. So IQ, as everybody knows, emotional intelligence is EQ, and then OQ, which is organizational intelligence. And when I'm working as part of the system, like the system that you all are trying to change, and I'm also trying to change internally, when I'm working in systems of government or public health or healthcare, I really have to think about OQ, organizational intelligence, around how do I influence that person in power, whether it be a man or a person of privilege. And sometimes I can't get them to hear me, and I need to think very strategically about who can I get around them to hear me out, to hear this position, to hear the justification for us to pursue food justice and food sovereignty. And that's often how I found things to move along, is that you can't just keep screaming at the same person. You have to find ways to get them to hear the message through other ways, and leveraging the organization who's around them, who sort of power mapping around them to then garner that change. And I do feel like topics of food justice and food sovereignty isn't really mainstream in healthcare yet. And it really is a matter of like, how do you think strategically about changing leaders' minds around what they think their role is in pursuing greater justice and equity in the societies that we are all part of.
Yeah, sorry, another loaded question, right? It's definitely one in which I know all of us are trying to find that equitable point, and I really love both of your points here. I hearing from this part of the conversation, a lot of the challenges being exploitative labor issues, land access, preventable health issues, being able to find more leadership roles for women, or just equity within that landscape. So I want to sort of start to shift the conversation towards how we're overcoming these challenges within the work that you're doing. My first question is for Lillian. We know that Native communities are tremendously diverse, with vastly different histories, rural versus urban, some with land, others without. yet the mainstream narrative is that we are monolithic. Can you talk about the diversity of practices and foodways within different Native communities and if Native chefs are merging some of the elements together, so creating a little bit of a fusion within Native foodways?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So, as you indicated, Indigenous communities are diverse in their practices and foodways. And, specifically where I come from here in the Southwest, I come from the Hopi community. I also, on my mother's side and on my father's side, I'm Salt River Pima or Akmal Atam and also Quetzal. And so my tribal affiliations and nations are spread out through Arizona and also on the Mexican U.S.-Mexico border as well. And so here in the Southwest, within my own background and within my own tribal communities, we are seed keepers and we are also agrarian people and farmers. So our identity as farmers is tied to, our own ability to be able to grow traditional varieties of crops in a very dry landscape. And so my people are located up in the northern Arizona region, where we're considered a high desert region. And our farming practices and our seeds have co-evolved with the seasons within the Southwest, seasons of drought, seasons where we have plenty of rainfall. And so our seeds are drought tolerant, and so are we. We're climate adapted to this region. And so that's who we are as a people. We traverse the landscape here to grow our drought tolerant and drought adapted seeds. And then also, we're able to hunt and forage and live off the land here in northern Arizona. But when you go to the Pacific Northwest coast and you see some of the tribes that are located up there, the Salish, the Kootenai, there's many, many tribes. They're salmon people, and they exist. Their existence is tied to the rivers and to the waters, large watersheds. And so the practices there have evolved with the salmon or the Chinook salmon or other varieties of fish as well. The Olechon Grease Trail was one of the largest documented migrations of the Olechon fish varieties, which actually provided sustenance for many, many tribal cultures and tribal peoples along the Pacific Northwest coast. If you look up into the plains, within the United States into the Dakotas, many of our Lakota and Dakota relatives and other tribes within that region have existed primarily in relation to the buffalo as well. And so wherever you go within the Indigenous landscape and foodscape, there are just our tremendous practices and foodways that exist. And even in this conversation, there was mention of cultural practices and also traditions around the care of food and the preparation of food as well. And many of our nations who are in closer proximity to each other have also shared seeds and food traditions and have, developed our own unique ways in which we curate food and the way in which we gather, grow, or harvest foods as well. And so within the vast ecosystem within Indigenous communities and Native chefs, there are, communities who are actively restoring their food traditions and who are actively highlighting those food traditions. And so we see many Native chefs that are emerging and are gaining momentum and who are being highlighted, such as the sous chef, Sean Sherman. He, just started his own restaurant, Owamni, which is located up in the upper Midwest in the Minnesota region. And so he is highlighting, Indigenous foods from that specific region, as well as we see Brian Yazzie as another emerging chef who is from the Southwest region, but who is based in the upper Midwest and who highlights regional and traditional foods in his work as well. There are many, many other Indigenous chefs, Sewa Yuli, who is from Mexico and the United States, from from indigenous communities there within that region. She is also highlighting indigenous cuisine and indigenous foods from her heritage in Mexico as well. And so we see the merging of all of these different elements, and we always have, traditionally, when our nations were able to get together for gatherings, ceremonies, or larger events, food was at the center of all of our, and continues to be at the center of our gatherings. And so there's, I think, through the reconnection and through the work that the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance is doing to reconnect and bridge the indigenous communities through hosting indigenous foodways gatherings. We also see the strengthening of our own cultural relationships and in foodways to each other. And so it's just really exciting, and it's really wonderful to see indigenous chefs being highlighted within the work that they're doing to restore indigenous foods as well.
Yeah, it really is almost like the food is medicine that Rita was mentioning earlier, right? Because it's definitely that balance of like emotional connection to the food, but actually the food being so wholesome that it's healing you from the inside out. With that, I want to transition to Rita, a question for you. What do you see as the role of healthcare in collaboration with the private and public sectors in addressing some of the challenges named by our speakers?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, healthcare is a really powerful entity. It accounts for almost a fifth of our GDP. And off the bat, I think about sourcing. And as a purchaser of food, there is a movement within healthcare to source better food, to be offering better food to our patients in hospitals and in healthcare. And so I think that's one of the ways that we can sort of talk the talk and put our money where our mouth is, and decide to source our food from BIPOC communities, from locally grown sources, food that is generated and distributed in a very equitable way. So that's my first thought around healthcare's role in this. Another aspect of it, which we've worked on, is how can healthcare play a bit greater role in food security and enabling our disenfranchised communities greater access to food. And so we all know that our societies are set up with unjust policies that systemically oppress people of color, low-income communities, indigenous peoples. And so what we envision is, how do we create a healthcare delivery system that is more representative of the values that we espouse around justice? So specific to the work we've done, we've actually looked at changing Medicaid policy, for example, to direct Medicaid dollars to actually pay for food, because food could be medicine. Like, as you had sort of echoed earlier, is that rather than taking pills all the time, if people actually had access to healthy food that was, equitably produced, that would contribute to the health of not just the individual, but of the community that they're part of. And so that's something that we've been working on in California, is how do we get our state Medicaid to actually pay for food, and to address food security and nutrition security.
Yeah. I want to transition the conversation a little bit back to Rosalinda and Naima. I'm a child of immigrants, and with that, I could only really begin to understand the layers of complexity and vulnerability that come with migration and what that can do to someone. Can you speak to this and how you build leadership within the communities of farm workers you organize? Rosalinda, we could start with you.
Yes, I wanted to speak to that. And for the farm worker community, I was listening to Rita. The whole idea of healthcare and the impact of actually growing food in the industrial food system causes so many health issues for farm workers in relation to the chemicals that are used to grow food on the land anymore. The use of all different types of pesticides. Pesticides are a cumulative poison that builds up in people's bodies. And I think consumers are aware of this, and organic production in the United States needs to grow. But when farm workers are immigrants and they come to the United States, some of the easiest jobs and the quickest jobs for them to get are actually working in the fields. And they have no choice whether to choose an organic farm or a conventional farm that uses chemicals. I think it's a question of actually surviving and making it's about making money and being able to pay your rent. And I think some of the work that we do as an organization with immigrant farm workers, I mean, 90% of the farm workers in the United States are undocumented immigrants. And these are undocumented immigrants from all over the world, the majority from Mexico and South America. But there's also Hmong farm workers, there's Hmong, farm workers from all over. And the need to have to work in an industrial food system that is growing food that is sold and marketed in such a huge level as Malik was speaking about, and yet at the same time not being able to access your traditional foods that you used to have back home. I love listening to about the Native Americans. I forget Miss Hill. About how you grow food in relation to the land. You grow food that the land can produce and should be producing, not forcing Mother Earth to grow products or food that is not native, not traditional to that land itself. I think as farm workers, we are looked at as labor, as machines, as production machines to grow into the industrial food system that is marketed to people not in a healthy way. That it's not healthy since it's being produced with pesticides. What we are trying to do in our organization is work with immigrant farm workers to produce the food that they traditionally eat. And we are have actually a cooperative development program in our area, in our organization, which is the largest project area that we have, where we have farm workers from different types of Mexico growing their traditional foods organically in worker-owned co-ops. So they actually own the farm. They grow the food on the farm that they want to grow, that is native to their, I shouldn't say native, but that is culturally appropriate for their bodies, and also they're producing food that other immigrant families are asking for because they can't get in the marketplace in a healthy way. Like, healthy eggs, organic food, organic cactus is becoming a big market for our farm worker owned co-op, because in Mexico we eat cactus and it's one of the healthiest foods that there is. So one of the things that we're doing is actually providing land as best as we can, which is one of the hardest things to get, and then providing the resources to immigrant farm workers to grow the foods that they know their communities want to eat. And for us, that is how we're saying this is what food sovereignty looks like. I think that the challenge for us in just listening here is that we are trying to farm in the best way that we know how to protect the land, keep ourselves healthy, but also on tribal lands that are also being protected by our Native brothers and sisters in the lands that we're at in the Northwest. And I think that those partnerships need to grow some more about how do we really work together to do the best that we can to save the salmon and other creatures that are native to that land and produce food together so we're all healthy. We're up against a huge corporate industry that is really looking to sell food, like Malik was saying, that is not healthy, right? You can't have food security. And in our community as immigrants, we suffer greatly from diabetes and many other diseases because we cannot get to our culturally appropriate foods that we need. So we're hoping that in trying to raise enough funding, buy land, and have worker-owned co-ops so we don't have bosses, we're ourselves producing the food that our community needs and respecting the land that has been cared for since time immemorial by the local, tribal people, that we create something new, a new way of being together on the land and being healthy with the food that we know that we want to eat and need to eat to stay healthy.
I would add, I think the challenge for us is because we're so far away from our country, we don't have that direct access to, seeds that, we historically been preserving. And another piece is, culturally and religiously, we eat a lot. We consume a lot of halal meat, primarily goat meat, which Minnesota doesn't have the proper infrastructure for slaughtering goat religiously, and also it's really, I think my community right now is hungry, for producing food that they're familiar with, food that are native to my country. But the biggest barrier for us is not just the land access, is really making sure that we're not far away from the community, which majority of the community live in urban setting. There's over 100,000 Somalis in the city of Minneapolis or around that area. So logistically, it's been a challenge for us trying to coordinate an area where we can come together. Like I said earlier, we do things communal. And so for us, it's really accessing the space and finding resources to, produce, the culturally food that we're familiar with. So that's what we're dealing with. But with our targeted location in South Minneapolis, our focus is really making sure that the community has access to fresh produce. So a majority of the things we grow are leafy greens. Again, because we have a very short window growing season, but now we're looking into expanding in grain, like I said, millet and sorghum and a few other things.
Yeah, it's definitely sounds like you're trying to make sure that you're creating a space that feels very inclusive of your community, right? Both with the food, but then also Rosalinda even talked about, co-op, so like building co-ownership. And I want to transition the conversation to Malik, who I know is working on a project, specifically a co-op, in addition to all the other work that you do. So my question to you is, in addition to centering food, you're also centering the growers' access to land for small-scale regenerative farming versus industrial farming, which we've been talking about, and recirculating capital throughout the community. Why is this important to empower your community in this way?
So I want to first kind of address the earlier question about obstacles just briefly, and say when I think about obstacles, I think about it in two ways. There's the ongoing external obstacles that are a result of capitalism and the system of white supremacy and patriarchy. And so one of the ways that that manifests is it becomes very difficult to get capital to do the kind of large scale community-based projects that we need to significantly transform the food system. And there's all kind of assumptions made about Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities when people do market studies that really devalue those communities, and again, make it even more difficult to get access to capital. But in addition to that, there's the internal challenges that we face as a result of living in an oppressive system. All people who are oppressed by the system begin to internalize notions about themselves as being not as worthy as people who are considered to be white by this society. But in the case of African American people and people of African descent in the so-called Western Hemisphere, we have a particular challenge that we're striving to overcome, and that is the association that we have of farming with the enslavement of our ancestors. In fact, Sister Leah Penniman, who's the author of Farming While Black, often says that the land was the scene of the crime, that there's a tremendous amount of trauma associated with the system of enslavement and the system of sharecropping, which exploited Black labor to create white wealth. And so many Black people still see farming through that lens of exploitation. And so an important part of our work with the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is the reframing of agricultural work as an act of community self-determination, and trying to help people grow beyond the mindset that sees agriculture work as only being associated with enslavement and sharecropping. One of the things that we're doing in addition to the reframing work, as you mentioned, is we're creating a food co-op, the Detroit People's Food Co-op. And we think it's important that people exercise sovereignty throughout the food system, that we exercise control throughout the food system. But certainly on the retail level, that's the most basic level that most consumers interact with the food system. And so it's important that on that basic level, that consumers, that community members are owning and controlling those vehicles through which we distribute food to our communities. If we don't have a lens of community self-determination and cooperation, then we might see the problem of food, the lack of access to high quality food as being solved by a Walmart coming to a community. Certainly that can provide greater access to food, but it doesn't empower communities to have a say-so over the food system that provides their food. And so we think that cooperatives are one of the best solutions that we have in the context of a capitalist system to galvanize our collective consciousness, to galvanize our collective wealth, and to relearn how to practice democracy on a community level so that we, along with our neighbors, are making decisions about what our aspirations are and how we achieve those aspirations. So we are very far along in the process of building a building called the Detroit Food Commons, a new 31,000 square foot, 2-story building that will house the Detroit People's Food Co-op, this cooperatively owned grocery store that we've been working on for more than 10 years. In fact, the Detroit People's Food Co-op will be the tenant on the first floor of the Detroit Food Commons, and then the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network will operate 4 shared use kitchens, community meeting space, and office spaces on the second floor of the building. Also, I want to mention in closing that we're also members of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. And so while we think it's important that work be done on the local level, it's also important that we understand that the system that continues to create great disparities in who has access to high quality food is not just a local system. In fact, frankly, it's not just a national system, it's a global system. So it's important that we work on the local level, it's important that we work nationally, and it's important that we work globally. We achieve that national work through working with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, which does a number of things to galvanize food activists, both those who are farmers, those who are working on policy, those who are running farmers markets and creating food co-ops, into a cohesive, compelling force so that we can build the kind of power in our communities that we need to take control of the food system that provides our food.
I love it. I love the work that you all are doing. I can't wait to see it in person next time I visit Detroit. And this really helps transition to kind of like the what's next, right? And how people can support your work. So I'll definitely circle back to you, Malik, on that. Right now, I want to start with Rita and Rosalinda. I saw some messages in the chat with our presenters or our panelists here talking about how we need more cross-cultural solidarity amongst the groups that we're working with. And that's exactly the question I have is how can a strategy of cross-cultural and cross-sector solidarity help to advance the food sovereignty movement? Rita, can we start with you?
Yeah, I will say for us at the Food is Medicine Collaborative, our vision is actually thriving communities supported by equitable, respectful healthcare and just resilient food systems. So inherent in sort of our vision and our mission is bridging different sectors so that we can get together and actually address these larger problems around justice and food sovereignty. And so a key part of how we operate is partnership, cross-collaboration, working with different sectors to achieve greater systems change, because ultimately we can't program ourselves out of the problems and the inequities that we see. We actually have to change the systems that have created these systemic inequities. And so it's wonderful to hear the various examples that exist across the country. And a lot of it inspires what we do locally and the types of food organizations that we partner with and source from to be part of this greater ecosystem of change. And so everything that's been said today is really just very inspiring and also reinvigorates our efforts to recognize like what can healthcare as a system, as a large payer do to actually influence this space and support the work that everyone else on this panel is doing.
Thank you, Rita. Rosalinda, do you want to add to that?
I do. I think that when you're talking about liberation and you're talking about undoing patriarchy and white supremacy, it really, when you look at food and food sovereignty, that is the best way, in my opinion, to move forward a liberation direction for our communities. Because when people are eating what they need to eat the way they want to eat it, and growing it themselves even, or at least having access to food that is being grown by their own community, and they're healthy and they're able to use that growing of food into what we call a solidarity economy, which means we're growing our own food, and then our market is our own people, and we're circulating capital within our own communities. That is really empowering, and I think it inspires others around us to look at food and look at liberation from a different perspective, from a community building perspective. I think that food sovereignty, really digging into food sovereignty, which is going beyond food security, but really looking at how people can feed themselves the way they want to feed themselves, and getting access to land to do that becomes very critical. Accessing capital so that you can have land to grow food and being able to provide healthy food to your own community is essential for the liberation, especially of farm workers and poor people everywhere. I know that it's more difficult in rural areas. We're in urban areas. We're in a rural area. In agricultural land, food producing land in rural areas is really expensive, but at least there's some food producing land in rural areas. In urban centers, it's a little bit more difficult, but I think that there's ways to have rural urban partnerships when you're talking about food sovereignty, food security, and solidarity. It's a road to liberation that we have to work together to do more in building that cross-cultural awareness, but also the different techniques that are inherent to our cultures that we bring into the United States. I've always thought that the future of the United States is really in its immigrant community, especially the future of actually having a food system that can support everybody. I think right now with the industrial food system, there's plenty of food for everybody. It's not about that. It's about who actually has access to it and what kind of food is being put out there for our communities. So yeah, I think that this is exciting actually listening to everybody here, and the things that are possible. I think consumers need to be very careful when they shop for food and really think about these things when you put food on your plate, because you're eating it. You're eating our joy or our sorrow or our exploitation.
Yeah, thank you for framing it in that way, Rosalinda. And that is a great transition to my last question. I had a few other questions, but we're not going to be able to get to it with the few minutes that we have left before we open it up to the audience questions. But my last question for some of you to answer, which Rosalinda just briefly touched on right now at the end, was what can the audience watching do to help advance your movements? And this may be following you, subscribing to your newsletters, or it could be something even broader. Could it be embracing a plant-based diet? Could it be, spending some time volunteering on your farm? What does that look like for people watching? What can they do tomorrow to help advance your work?
I would like to say people should eat organic no matter what you're eating. You should eat organic and make sure that the food that you're eating is not being produced with chemicals and toxins and antibiotics in the animals that you're eating. But also, I invite everybody to check out our website, foodjustice.org, and keep track of our work. And we are a big supporter of solidarity, building a solidarity economy by supporting worker-owned co-ops. I think that owning the means of production by workers is one way to liberate. So buy organic, buy fair trade, support your local co-ops in any way that you can.
Thank you, Rosalinda. Anybody else want to add in?
I would go ahead and also add that, it's important for us as we, build solidarity economies and, really reconnect our communities and strengthen our work as Indigenous, as Black, as people of color communities. It's important for folks who are listening, who are, part of, I guess, the settler culture, settler the settler paradigm. It's important that folks work to ask the question, how can I become ally or a relative to this work, to our communities and to our nations? And I think it's imperative that folks also work to continue to challenge and work towards breaking down barriers that continue to violate Indigenous communities or marginalized communities. And being an ally requires social action, strength, courage, humility, and a support network. So I would encourage folks to continue to be good allies in this work and to be relatives in this work, to support our communities and to, move in a way that continues to build solidarity while challenging these systems that continue to oppress our communities and our nations in the current paradigm that we live in.
I would also add our targeted location. We've been getting a lot of requests, and our number of participants grows each year. So we don't have enough space. So I would request or get support in terms of land access, and we're always seeking ways to expand and grow. So if those folks that have space and they don't know what to do with that space, we would be happy to grow food for the community and expand and grow.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for answering my questions. I want to open it up to some of the questions, really thoughtful questions that we've been receiving in the chat by the audience. The first question being, can you speak to the effect of urbanization on Black farms?
I can jump in on that and say that urbanization has a negative impact on American farming generally. That we're seeing the sprawl. We're seeing urban sprawl, and many of the areas that we call peri-urban areas that used to be used for farming are now being used for condominiums and subdivisions. And then we find also that we have a high concentration of African Americans in large cities, and we see land grabs and gentrification in those cities also. And so it makes it difficult for those of us who are doing urban farming and who are trying to do it to scale to obtain the land necessary to do farming closer to where we have these concentrations of population density. Unfortunately, most municipal governments see urban farming as kind of a cute temporary use of land until real development comes along, like somebody wants to build a parking structure or a housing complex or something like that. And so we have a tremendous job to do also in changing the mindset of elected and appointed officials so that they see the value of farmland as an urban function, and they also see the value of green spaces in cities in general and are not just driven by the kind of profit motive that typically drives people in the capitalist system.
Thank you, Malik. I have a second question here from the audience. Speaking about green spaces, the question is, how do you create sustainable food programming? For example, establishing community gardens that are cared for annually and not just one season initiative.
Well, I would like to say that the community gardens that I've seen that have been successful have been created by people that really needed the food and grew out of necessity when neighbors came together and cleared certain components of land and then fought to keep the land. Additionally, though, some of these successful community gardens that have been built created community around them just because people are working together in small plots. But unfortunately, right now, they're disappearing because of what Malik was talking about. This development that, and the need for housing, low income housing. I mean, it's just like when you have to give up a beautiful community garden, you lose a beautiful community garden that has brought community together, is producing good food, to building low income housing. It's like the ultimate in capitalism and abuse and violence, in my opinion, that you make people choose between low income housing and eating fresh, good food and community building. I think that there's a lot of those types of issues that do involve political involvement of all of us to try to stop this kind of choosing your necessity. It's shameful, really, in many areas.
I'll add something there from the perspective of working in some of these systems and having worked in government. And what we found successful through our collaborative work was tying the aims of the work into a system that can then own it and sustain it. So in the case of healthcare, starting food programming in healthcare spaces, creating these food pharmacies where people could fill prescriptions for food and pick up food in the clinics, started off with like small funds, pilots. But then eventually when we got the system to see that it's part of their job, then we were able to step away and they actually run their programming on their own. And I think in similar spaces, I wonder those who are interested in starting community gardens, could you partner with the local public health department or the social services department and find a way for them to buy into it so that it's also a shared program and a shared endeavor. So it's harder to just like easily let it drop off after one season, that if there's institutional buy-in, that might be one way to help promote that sustainability and convert the system to be one that's more just and equitable.
Thank you so much for sharing. I want to hop into our next question here, which is, how do you suggest that white presenting persons promote participation in a way that encourages our community to embrace Native and Indigenous farming practices without crossing the line into appropriation?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that. I think I would pose a question to the individual here and to the audience of, again, asking yourself, what does it mean to be a genuine ally to our communities and to this work? And I think being a genuine ally involves, again, self-reflection, education, and listening. It means knowing that white presenting people often come into spaces from a position of power and privilege. And privilege that has been gained through unjust system and the marginalization of Indigenous communities and other communities that folks seek to gain allyship with. And so it's not enough just to show up in solidarity and speak out against unjust systems. I think folks have to also do what is within their power to work towards dismantling systems as well. I think number one, listening to and following the community. So finding out who the traditional owners and elders of are, who the traditional owners and elders are of the land you're working on when doing long-term work, within the landscape that you're working on. It's important to acknowledge those nations that existed there and continue to exist within the space that you're working in. It's important to center the stories around community. And so amplifying the voices of Indigenous communities, learning, the historical and cultural context, never showing up empty-handed if you are in allyship with communities as well is important. Seeking consent and permission. Being responsible for yourself as well, knowing when to step back, being mindful of other folks and doing no harm, I think, to the communities. It's important. Nowadays there's a lot of appropriation happening where white presenting folks are learning knowledge from Indigenous communities and then internalizing that knowledge and then regurgitating that knowledge as if it is their own knowledge. That's absolutely inappropriate. And I think that it takes away the traditions and the culture and language and kinship values that are already embedded within our community. So as much as folks want to profit off of the knowledge and write books and become experts in the field, it's important that that Indigenous peoples are always centered in this work, and that folks communities who want to embrace Native and Indigenous farming practices need to center, collaborate, and always support and uplift Indigenous and POC communities always, I think.
Thank you, Lillian. We have just a couple of minutes left. We'll probably be able to get through just one more question, maybe two. The next question here is, what's the best way to get the younger generation interested in food and farming? I feel like programs die out because old leaders are not passing the necessary knowledge and motivation down to younger leaders that take their place.
I would just say briefly that it's important that we recognize that true mentorship is needed in this work, and that it's important to embrace the younger generation in a way where we are not socially reproducing, the internalized oppressive behaviors, I think, that we see within our communities and within this work and within our movements, and that founders or those who have knowledge and understanding do not want to see it as a power dynamic and do not want to let go of that, and therefore see younger people as a threat to this work that we're involved in. And so, as we know, within our traditional worldview, especially for me as an Indigenous person, I feel like there is a rite of passage, or there are ways in which we center and we embrace and nurture the younger generation. And it's important to do that in the best way possible, with prayers, with care, and with intention. And I feel like it's important for us as leaders in this work to center and prioritize the health and well-being of the younger generation, knowing that, our work, we can take our work so far, but it's important not to become embedded in a founder syndrome mentality, which then seeks to exclude the younger people, or that we center ourselves as the all-important elders or the all-important folks because of our positionality, our education, our experience, and then, impose that on younger people or make them feel, that they're not worthy or that they can't participate in this work. And so I feel like that's a really great question. And for myself, I feel very strongly about being a mentor to the younger generation. So in all of the work that I've done this far and the work that I continue to do, will always prioritize the health and well-being of younger people, and making spaces and pathways for them to not only be engaged in the work, but become embodied in this work and become, those young elders and those leaders that we really need, because they represent, they're embodied a lot of times, and they represent, I think, the new seed, which has many, many potentials beyond our own experience as well.
What
Thank
I've
you so
seen
much,
in
Lily. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Justin. What I've seen in my community over the years, especially with COVID, we lost a lot of our elders, and we're losing our culture. So for me, there's an urgency working with the elders, spending time with them, collecting that story, documenting, which, in addition to losing 40 years basically of, because of the Civil War, we lost a lot of our ways. And so again, for me and for my community, there's the urgency to really preserve that cultural piece, and also collecting that story from our elders is something that I am really passionate about.
It's important work, and it takes time. And I think sometimes people feel like they don't always have the time for that, right? It's definitely a mind shift. I have time for one last question here. Any thoughts on the concept of community food / resiliency utility? Public utilities are meant to supply goods and services that are considered essential. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Okay, go ahead, Rosalinda.
I've always thought that every local government should have a department of food, other than, permitting with the health department or other things. But I've always thought that there should be some kind of civil responsibility towards a food system at the local level. Civil responsibility means civic responsibility towards ensuring that food sovereignty exists in your community. And that would be like paying like some kind of nominal tax that goes into a fund, so that there's participatory democracy in deciding how food is going to be produced, looking at food sheds and making them be productive on what the land can produce, not what profit can be made from growing certain products. So I don't know if that's what you meant by that, but I think that food production and food security and food sovereignty should be, in my opinion, a civic responsibility of every eater.
Thank you all so, so much for all of your insights, for sharing your backgrounds and all of the work that you do. I thought that this was a really insightful conversation. Pardon my quick transitions. I was just trying to make sure that I gave you the most time to be able to share everything that you're doing. So I want to pass it back to Brian, who's going to rejoin us and close us out for the evening.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Wonderful moderating. And thank you, panel, for just phenomenal insights and ideas and information. Really, really glad to have you here. And also want to give a special thanks to Renee Ghost for her wonderful performance at the top that started us with such a great fashion. I want to again thank our promotional partners, Community to Community, the Food is Medicine Collaborative, the Native Food Sovereignty Alliance, and Todo Verde. On behalf of everyone here at the WNET Group, big thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you'll return next Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern, for More Than Shelter, a town hall about homelessness and community. Learn more at 13.org/close to home. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. We'll see you in a week.